Thank you everybody for coming. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Kristin Carpenter. It's okay. Our speaker tonight is Kristin Carpenter. She's the executive director at the Copper River Watershed Project, which is a community-based nonprofit that works to ensure the long-term sustainability of the Copper River salmon-based ecosystem, economy, and culture. And she has lived in Cordova for 18 years, working on fish habitat restoration, tourism planning, and other regional issues throughout the watershed. So please help me welcome Kristin Carpenter.
Okay, so can you guys hear in Valdez? Is that, okay, well anyway, I'll start talking and you can see if, yeah, how's that? Can you hear?
We've lost the audio. We see you, but we don't hear you.
Okay, hold on. Just a minute. Right, I see you. Is that working? You can hear us now? Okay, great. Okay, super. That's okay. It was just a quick intro. I'm gonna, so I'll start. So, no, that's all right. As Megan said, I'm Kristin Carpenter with the Copper River Watershed Project, and I thought I would just give a quick intro and explanation about the organization itself. And as I was thinking about giving this talk, and I thought it was a little bit, ironic isn't the right word, but maybe there's some continuity, some consistency. The Copper River Watershed Project got started in the mid-90s because the town of Cordova was in this economic tailspin after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And a lot of people were trying to figure out what could we do to help diversify the economy here and get out of the downward spiral that Cordova had found itself in. You know, when in the mid-90s, or by 5 years after the spill, there were half as many processors in Cordova. And a lot of people had left town. There was a lot of social disruption, you know, divorce, substance abuse, things like that. It was pretty epic. I wasn't here, but that's what I have heard. And so Ricky Ott held a series of workshops on sustainable development and was trying to figure out how do we get ourselves out of this tailspin? What can we do to diversify the economy and still maintain our quality of life? And there was a lot of talk about large-scale cruise ships and clear-cutting the East Delta, and then drilling for mining the coal, drilling offshore for oil. And some people said, well, those are some ideas. What are some other ideas? What are some other things we could do that might not involve those things? And so that's when Ricky hit on this idea of sustainable development. So we started talking about how do we diversify the fisheries? How do we bring in tourism? How do we build tourism maybe in a different kind of tourism? So we started looking at small-scale independent traveler tourism. We didn't do so much in forestry just because that wasn't really, we have just small diameter timber here, not much in the way of merchantable timber. So we've mostly focused on the fisheries and fish habitat restoration and tourism in this area. And the other idea that came out of those meetings was people were talking about what could we do here in Cordova, and somebody said, well, Sherry Shaw, who was the director of CDFU at the time, she said, well, it won't amount to a hill of beans if we just talk about it down here. We need to be looking upriver, talking to the communities upriver. What can we do with those folks to help maintain the fish habitat that supports our fisheries? And so that's when people said, oh, a watershed, right, I get it, the whole Copper River watershed. And that's partly why I think this is such a good subject to be talking about tonight too, in that theme, because the Trans-Alaska Pipeline is something that affects our whole watershed. And the Copper River, people talk about the Copper River watershed, but it's really a Copper River system. The Copper River is one river, but it's fed by at least a dozen major tributaries and many more smaller tributaries, smaller streams. But it's one big whole watershed system. So we try to talk about how can we think on a watershed scale, how can we plan on a watershed scale. And this is a pretty good example of that, because the Trans-Alaska Pipeline traverses about 20% of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline goes through our watershed. We're the southernmost half. We also happen to be the most of the whole Trans-Alaska Pipeline line, where the Copper River drainage is the most seismically active section of the pipeline. There are other parts of the region that have other issues, but we have that. So, yeah, nice little factor. So I'm going to talk about citizen oversight for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and what we can do to, why we think that's important and what we can do to try to foster it. And I want to, so we've had a couple of workshops over the last 3 years in the region. We had one in Valdez in 2009. In 2010, we went up to Copper Center up in the Copper Basin and had a meeting up there. And from those meetings, the mission statement that we came up with is this: citizens promoting safe transportation of oil and gas from the North Slope to Valdez. And I tell people too that everyone has a map of Alaska in their pocket. It's in your hand. So here's our little map of Alaska. The pipeline goes from the North Slope down to Valdez. There's my little map. I don't know if you guys can see it. Just holding out a hand. And I want to also stress too that, because it happens when we are up in the basin and we're talking about Alyeska and the pipeline, some people get a little nervous because they think that we're antagonistic. And I want to stress that we are not anti-pipeline. We are not against Alyeska. We just want to see Alyeska keep the oil in the pipe. And when I guess too, when I say Alyeska, I mean the owner companies that make up Alyeska, because Alyeska is one company made up of Exxon, BP, ConocoPhillips. Mark Swanson can probably tell me the others. I'm not sure who the current partners are right now, but I think.
Consoro and probably Chevron to a smaller extent.
Right, because it used to be the Koch brothers and they sold out, and so anyway, yeah, so that's the consortium right now. BP is the majority owner, so that's factors into our thinking. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. That's it gives you pause, doesn't it? That's kind of the whole thing. So yeah, we want the TAPS owners to protect Alaska and manage the pipeline safely and responsibly to keep the oil in the pipe. That's our goal. So there's the map of the pipeline. You can see it crossing the state, and these dots are all the different pump stations. When it was constructed, there were 12 pump stations constructed, and they have since automated at least 4, I want to say. So, and again, Mark probably is a little bit more current. I should know the numbers of that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. And the pipeline was constructed and started running in the late 70s. I think 76 is when it started. And then we went through, it was initially granted a 30-year lease. They went through a lease renewal process in 2002 and then renewed the lease to start running in 2003 through 2034. And so the lease allows the pipeline to cross all these state and federal lands up and down the pipeline corridor. So that's one of the governing regulations, is the lease, the federal lease and the state grant of a right-of-way for the pipeline to cross those lands. There are some lease stipulations in there that require Alyeska to operate the pipeline to certain standards. And our concern is that the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System crosses many, many rivers. And so we're concerned about some of the rivers it crosses in the Copper River Watershed, which is the Gulkana, for starters, the Gulkana, the Taslina, the Klutina, the Tonsina, and the Little Tonsina. But it also crosses the Yukon, which I think is that image, and there's the Tanana River crossing. I think actually these are both the Tanana, because the Yukon River crossing is a big bridge, right? It must be that one, but that's obviously a poor picture. That doesn't show up very well. But yeah, we're concerned about all of those river crossings. I mean, a breach in the line at any one of those could mean oil in a river, and that's a mess. You know, we don't want to have to think about that. I guess I'm pointing in the wrong direction. Yeah, and we've seen with recent examples, I mean, even before when we were talking about this, these incidents hadn't happened, but there was a spill in Michigan in 2010, I want to say, and then, oops, I think I went, no? Oh, well, anyway, the Deepwater Horizon, obviously, and then, pointing in the wrong place, the Yellowstone River spill in 2011. And it's just really, it's a much different cleanup proposition than I think cleaning up oil in the ocean, where maybe you can boom it off. you can get skimmers in there. When you're talking about cleaning oil up from a river system, you've got vegetated banks, sandy shores. The Copper River is a braided system, so there's not one confined channel. Yeah, I mean, every time I start to talk about this, people get this look on their face. It just washes over like, oh my goodness, this is not something we ever want to have to think about, and that's why we say prevention is so critical. So that's the conundrum. The maintenance concerns, the pipeline is aging. It had a design life of 30 years, and yes, it had a design life of 30 years. Alyeska has done quite a bit to update the systems and to upgrade it along the way. When they did strategic reconfiguration, where they automated a bunch of the pump stations, they did a lot of upgrades and made a substantial investment. I know that project cost way more than they thought it would because they had to do some of those things. But still, there has been corrosion over time. One of the things we're really concerned about are the valves. I don't have a good handle on how frequently they inspect those valves. So there has been a lot of wear and tear. And we're also concerned about the regulatory threshold in place. I think the law has a much lower threshold for risk than we as residents who live here have. I mean, I think most of you would probably say our threshold is pretty high. We wanted the companies to invest as much as they possibly can to protect this area because of our fisheries, our subsistence, our sport, and our commercial fisheries. And but there is no federal law that requires a valve to seal. The federal laws require the valve to function, and they require Alyeska to make sure they're in working order, but they don't actually have to seal. So there are things like that I think would that give us pause. And we've seen incidents. I mean, you've all seen headlines talking about the spill on the tundra in March of 2006. The pipeline was shut down in January of 2012 or 11, Mark. I have this written down, but I always forget because we have so many. 2011 is when...
2011, that was pump station 1.
Right. And then there was that leak at pump station 9 in 2010 when the tanks overflowed because the backup power system failed. And they still, I don't think, know why that happened. So there are these incidents that happen occasionally, and they can't always explain them, or they have to do some pretty detailed work to figure out the why of it. So those are things I think that are pretty concerning. There was another, we've listed check valve 109 on the Clutina River as one of our concerns. And what happened there wasn't actually a spill, but there was a leak of a different kind. There was a leak to the press. There was a long list of some repairs that folks at Alyeska thought should be made, and those repairs weren't getting made, and this list got leaked to the press, and the person who was the head of operations at the terminal, at Valdez Marine Terminal for Alyeska at the time, was all of a sudden reorganized out of a job within a week because this information became public. And so that to me says there are people who did not want this information to be known, and they were going to deal with it the way they knew how. And I think one of the reasons replacing a check valve is not an insignificant job. It's expensive, it takes time, it takes manpower. I don't know that if they would have had to shut the line down probably for a certain amount of time. So there are reasons why doing some of these things are not at the top of the owner company's list, but they're important. And the Clutina River crossing is actually an underground crossing. But the issue with these check valves and even with the underground crossings is that, up in the basin, these rivers cut through the bluffs. So the pipeline goes across the top of a bluff, down the side, under the river, up the other side, across the bluff, down the next embankment, under the river, up the other side. So there's a lot of pressure in the line where the oil's going downhill and then under the river. And then also under the buried crossings, I think, are some percentage more susceptible to corrosion. So it's going to be even longer till, if there were a leak under a river, it might be longer till anybody knew about it. So another reason.
So what's going on in this lower right picture here then?
I believe that is a drill.
A drill?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another concern is the leak detection system, which Alyeska uses to detect leaks. But to my knowledge, there haven't been any leaks. That all of the spills that have happened were detected by human observation, not by the leak detection system. And part of the problem is that it can't detect a leak smaller than 2,000 barrels a day. So if they set the threshold too low, they get all these false alarms all the time, and then pipeline workers become kind of, what's the word? I don't want to say immune, but you get fatigued by the constant false alarm, and then you think, that's not what it is, so well, that doesn't really, which happened in March of 2006. So, okay. This is some more information about some of the history of some of the leaks and incidents that have happened over time, and I do have a handout that lists more of these. And our big concern too is for strategic reconfiguration, because I mentioned earlier that it's automated a bunch of the pump stations, so there are fewer people along the line to detect a spill and fewer people to respond when a spill does happen. The contingency plan they have in place now has 7 people on call for Glen Allen if there's a spill, and they say, well, we would draw more people from Fairbanks or Valdez. If there's a storm, if the travel conditions are bad, if they can't get those people there fast enough, I think that's pretty dangerous. And then too, a lot of their spill response plans call for putting boom vein across a river, and in some scenarios they might put 2 or 3 or 4 sections of boom vein across a river. And I always think, how are 7 people going to do that on the Taslina River? You know, it just seems like it would take a long time to get enough people together to really fully implement the response scenarios that they call out, to get these booms anchored on one side, get a boat across the river, set all that up. I just can't really see that working. So that's a big concern. A few years ago, we got some funding, and I can't remember now from whom. I was trying to think to give credit. And but we did work with EcoTrust, I can say that much. They did this great GIS map for us because we wanted to model a hypothetical spill scenario on the Taslina River. And so this is the inset up here in the upper right corner. And what we tried to estimate was, if there were a spill where the pipeline crosses the Taslina River, how long would it take? How quickly would oil flow downstream? And to be fair, or to be, I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I should say, we used hydrology data for river flow data, which is not how fast oil would flow. You know, oil in the Taslina River would probably form tar balls. It would go into certain channels maybe and get entrained on the shore. We had to make certain assumptions because we only had a certain amount of money and we couldn't do a lot of modeling. But, so there's my disclosure. If oil flowed as fast as water, it would be 23 river miles downstream in 6 hours. So that's 5 miles down the Taslina and another 18 miles down the Copper. And we chose 6 hours because 6 hours is when Alyeska said they could get to the spill site and begin cleanup. That doesn't help us, you know. That's so, and you know, also, I'm just admittedly talking about, we're all envisioning probably the worst case scenario. It could be a pinhole leak in the pipeline. It could be what they call a guillotine break, which is where the whole line ruptures. So it could be anything in between. But still, like I said, we don't want to see any oil in the river. Yeah. So what we've been trying to work on in the past few years is citizen oversight. How could we create the capacity for citizen oversight of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline? And the model already exists in the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council in Valdez, which has existed since 91 or 92 and was legislated in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 as a response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I think actually there was some kind of a contract in place even before the spill, that there was some beginnings of the organization or that actual function pretty early on. And, but I guess what I should also mention too is that, so you might say, well then why doesn't RCAC do it? Well, RCAC has been focusing for a long time on the Valdez Marine Terminal and tanker transport through the Sound. I think at one point the organization did start to maybe look at the pipeline itself, and Alyeska took them to arbitration. And that arbitration decision came down that no, you may not work on the pipeline. You can only use your contract funding that you get from Alyeska to work on the terminal and tanker transport through the Sound, which is unfortunate.
Kristin?
Yes. Any?
I think maybe I can just help on that.
Please.
This is Mark Swanson. I'm the executive director of the RCAC up there at Prince William Sound. And the enabling language in Open 90 restricts the remit of RCAC to look at the terminal and the associated tankers while operating in Prince William Sound. The contract language with Alyeska, you're correct, it predates actually the inaction of Open 90. They were under tremendous political pressure. They basically needed some sort of public license to continue operation, and so acquiescing to citizen oversight seemed like a prudent thing to do. And I think at that stage, post-spill, they were willing to sign anything. And so, a lot of the things that in there mirror what's in Open 90, but both Open 90 and the contract very specifically restrict our operations to the terminal and associated tankers. And so we've had lots of interested board members, because clearly things that happen upstream of the terminal could affect Prince William Sound. And even stuff going down the Copper River could swing around and affect Prince William Sound, and certainly affects the livelihood of lots of folks who live in Prince William Sound. So, our interests are common, the risks are common, but we've tried to extend our scope and reach and interest, but we've been pushed back with great success, unfortunately, because of the legal restrictions of both the contract and the enabling legislation.
Right. Although I will say too that in the Alaska Oil Spill Commission report from 1990, it's either dated 90 or 91, they did recommend citizen oversight for the whole schmear, the pipeline itself, the Valdez Marine Terminal, and the tanker transport. So this citizens oversight got implemented. I think of it as kind of a half measure. The job is only half done so far because the pipeline is not included in that. Okay. So just a quick summary of what Prince William Sound RCAC is currently able to do, and Mark can obviously chime in on this also if we didn't get it right, but they do a lot of monitoring. They do some of their own research. They've done a lot of research around things like dispersants. They did a lot of work around ballast water treatment. You did a lot of work around benzene coming out of the Valdez Marine Terminal and got things to improve. So they've done a ton of work that's been really successful. And I think they're going to keep on doing it. But a citizen oversight group should be able to provide advice, should be able to monitor, review plans, ideally have access to facilities, and participate in what I'd like ultimately for a citizen oversight group to be able to do for the pipeline is to be able to observe drills, participate and comment on potential and practice drills, and then, like I said before, RCAC does some of its own research, which is really great. And then here are some of the successes that they've had over time. And I think there's another slide after this. I think one of the interesting things for me is the geographic response strategies, because I think that a citizens oversight group for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline could also contribute a lot of local knowledge to spill response or even just maintenance in the area. I mean, I know that Alyeska has its own maintenance and the folks go up and down the right-of-way all the time, but if there were a spill, I think a lot of the locals know really quickly, like, what are good access points to the rivers? Where do they eddy out? What are some of the conditions where, soil types? I just think there's all kinds of good information that could be taken advantage of. And, down here in Prince William Sound, we have a whole fishing fleet that's trained in spill response. We could have the same thing upriver for people up there trained to help out in spill response, so that when those 7 people who are supposed to get boom vein across the Taslina need help, there could be some trained responders who would be there, I think, faster than somebody coming from Fairbanks.
Local knowledge.
Yeah, local knowledge is invaluable. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so more about Prince William RCAC's accomplishments. They've done the glacial iceberg radar detection. Like I said, the Valdez terminal vapor control, helping with air quality, and helping out with upgrading the fire suppression. And so one of our ideas, one of the most common responses I've heard from legislators is, oh my gosh, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, 800 miles. Prince William Sound RCAC has a board of 23 people, I want to say. How would you create a board for a pipeline that spans 800 miles? Well, one of the things I thought about, and we're trying to push for citizens oversight and start in this region, but one of the things we thought about was, well, you could break it down, and as it turns out, you could break it down by watersheds. You could have a chapter that runs from the north, that focuses on the north slope to Adigan Pass. You could have the Adigan Pass to Isabel Pass section, which includes the Yukon River, and then you could have the southern part of the line, which is from Isabel Pass to Valdez. So you could have chapters of citizen oversight so that these subgroups are focusing on those areas. And the concerns, I think, for our region, like I mentioned earlier, we have seismic activity. The North Slope, I think, is probably much more concerned about permafrost and what's happening with that. So there are going to be different geographic conditions, and each of these subchapters could address those and could, be more specialized and address those issues. And let's see. So that's one idea. Oops, did I? No, I didn't. Sorry. I'm getting used to the sensitivity of the remote control. Some of the desired elements of a Trans-Alaska Pipeline Independent Oversight Council would be things like RCAC has, access to information. We certainly would need assured funding. We could incorporate a nonprofit tomorrow that does citizen oversight for the pipeline, but we don't have guaranteed funding. We wouldn't have very much to support our work with, so that would be tough. Although at some point you probably have to just start and get something going regardless. Independence, obviously you want to be independent and credible to the public. You want to have access to facilities. It would be great to be able to have some kind of a specified response time frame if you ask for information, so that you don't get put off. Lobbying might be something, and ideally subpoena powers, although maybe that's more of a bargaining chip. I don't know that would be very likely. The industry wasn't, obviously that would be a pretty tough, a heavy lift. And I think some of the functions of a citizen oversight body would be to review contingency plans. The Alyeska is required to renew its contingency plan every 5 years, and then there are items that get commented on periodically, so that would be one thing. It'd be great to be able to commission and review scientific work like RCAC does. Review and research state-of-the-art technology and best management practices. We want to be able to monitor, look at preventive maintenance, look at drills, make recommendations to regulators, and like I said earlier, develop local response capacity and geographic response strategies. I probably don't have to say this to all of you here, but the big issue is what's at stake. Why are we concerned? Well, obviously, subsistence fisheries. I guess when I tell people about the Copper River Watershed, I say we have a subsistence salmon economy, we have a sport fish salmon economy, and we have a commercial salmon economy. And that really is what drives this region. And so that's what's at stake. Public resources, and then also private lands. The Otna Corporation, Chugach, Alaska, they've got lands in the pipeline corridor that I know they don't want to see oiled. And obviously, too, the salmon support the whole web of life, so there are wildlife populations, too, that could potentially be affected in the watershed and in the pipeline corridor, and recreational lands, certainly. So what can you do to help? We do have a website. I tried to make this darker, but I know it's hard to read. It's akpipelinesafety.org. If you know of an organization that would be interested in, or that would consider passing a resolution of support, that would be great. I believe I've omitted, I just noticed now, Native Village of Eyak has adopted a resolution of support for citizen oversight, so that should be added here. But we have a template of a resolution of support if anybody knows of another organization that would might be interested. And you can also contact your legislator and just say, this is something we feel strongly about and we feel is really important. And we have, at different times, talked to Senator Murkowski's staff and Senator Begich's staff, and they're pretty lukewarm about it. You know, they don't think it's such a pressing issue. One of the things I think we could do at a minimum in the meantime is just work with those legislator staff to try to at least get more current information from Alyeska and try to get it faster. You know, we typically have to go through a Freedom of Information Act process, which can take months, if not longer, and so I think that's one thing that we could do as citizens is just speed up the time so that we get current information, so that we're not getting reports on corrosion that are 2 years old, for example. So that's something we'd like to be able to do. I think there was something else I was going to mention, I forgot. Yeah, so that's it. You can, like I said, visit our website if you want. Resolutions of support, talk to friends and neighbors. We are in the process of applying for an AmeriCorps volunteer so that somebody can be our full-time person and work with us and work to reach out to stakeholders up and down the corridor to just build some awareness, because a lot of times I think people, it just doesn't even register. We talked at one point to the Fairbanks Soil and Water Conservation District, and they said, well, gosh, isn't it in Alyeska's best interest to keep the oil in the pipe? You know, they must be on top of this. Why do you guys think this is an issue? And we were like, wow, have you ever seen a rusty pipe? You know, they happen. So anyway, it's just not something, I think people, they just don't connect it with what are the possible threats to the rivers that the pipeline crosses. So we've got a lot of work to do just to, like I said, build some awareness, reach out to other stakeholders in the region, and begin to build our coalition. And but anyway, we are, like I said, applying for an AmeriCorps volunteer, and hopefully we'll be successful. So then if that goes through, then we would have somebody on staff for the year of 2013 to help us do that work. And we do have a strategic plan that we developed at a workshop a year ago, and ideally that person would be helping us implement that plan also in terms of communications and also doing a little bit of a, I would call it a gap analysis. You know, what do the current regulations require, and what is it we would like to see happen in terms of regular maintenance? How frequently does Alyeska cycle through checking the valves? How often do they do their corrosion inspections, things like that? Those are the things that we would really focus in on, I think. And yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions. And Mark, you might want to comment on any of that I've just covered, and I'm happy to.
Okay, well, I can just add a couple of things. I mean, you know, your whole talk about, you know, why would it be not in Alyeska's best interest to not have a leak? I mean, you know, think about the beach 2010 in the Gulf. You know, largely what happens where risks are understood or underestimated is you've got, you know, a resource extraction industry where all the profits are private and many of the risks are transferred to the public sector into the environment. And nobody realizes how unbalanced that equation is until something goes wrong. And so I think that's certainly the situation in the state. You talked about, you know, legislators being lukewarm, and I think, you know, they're much more amenable to talking about additional citizen oversight where there are new risks. And so lots of folks are talking about maybe the possibility of citizen oversight on, you know, the Chukchi and you know, and in the Arctic, because there's new stuff going on there. But this pipeline's been running, you know, for 35 years, and nobody sees anything new happening other than less oil. And a lot of people's maybe uneducated minds, that it translates to less risk.
You know, I just on that note, I was going to say, I remembered one more thing. The State Pipeline Coordinator's Office gave me a copy of an assessment that they did last year, or I think actually 2011. Because after the Pump Station 1 incident, they wanted to look into why did that happen, because there were some recommendations about looking at corrosion in that facility. And what they uncovered, or what they determined, was that Alyeska has a process for prioritizing regular work orders. You know, they've got a regular preventive maintenance program, and they prioritize those functions based on risk. But when it comes to what they call a project work request, which is kind of, might be like a one-time project to replace a valve or patch corrosion in a particular location, they don't prioritize that by risk. And that's what the State Pipeline Coordinator's Office determines. They do not prioritize it by risk, which I think is a pretty galling finding or conclusion to come to. It all comes down.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that report and suggest that you read it if you hadn't, but it sounds like you've already got it and read it. And what they said was actually slightly more nuanced than that. Alyeska does prioritize by risk, but they don't schedule by risk. And so they identified, you talk about pump station 1, that was a dead leg of piping buried in the cement, and there are lots of similar sections of pipe here on the terminal that you can't physically get at, and you can't inspect. And PHMSA requires that much of the pipeline be inspected every 3 years, physically inspected, so they run pigs down. And so Alyeska is known for many, many years that this was an area they couldn't get at, and suspected that lots of things were going on there, bad things, but they couldn't really get at it. And so identified that there was a high risk of corrosion, perhaps even loss of containment in this area, and assigned it a very high priority. And then they said, well, at what point will the regulators get after us if we don't do anything? And they figured, well, that's sort of a 3 to 5 year range. And so they scheduled the first, possibility of acting on it at 3 years out, and the last possibility for acting on it at 5 years out. And unfortunately, 1 year after they did the study, it rusted through and shut down the whole pipeline. And so I think the thing that people have to realize is, we have lots of friends and neighbors that work on the pipeline, and they're good people. But the decision makers live in London and in Houston, and they are not interested in spending an extra dime that's not required by regulation.
Yep. Yes, I thank you for reminding me about that. I did want to make that point earlier that when I talked earlier about people in the region getting defensive, and I think everybody who works for Alyeska is really proud of their work and does a good job, and we're not trying to say they don't. We're saying that the owner companies, like Mark said, make the spending decisions, and that's who we have to go to say you need to invest in this to maintain the pipeline integrity. Or bring
the other thing that's really important for citizens oversight is, you mentioned that, some of these response scenarios are kind of works of fiction. How 7 people are going to respond and effectively protect an estuary or a watershed. And that's one of the things that citizens oversight groups can do, is kind of put a spotlight on these works of fiction. And what we've figured out is that you can sort of tune up the response strategies and run exercises and shine lights on where things really don't measure up to unfulfillable promises. But the more you look at it, you realize that response really, it's all fiction. Once the oil's in the water, the damage is done. And so you really have to focus your efforts on robust prevention. And robust prevention is right back to that, State Office of Pipeline Safety report, which says, your maintenance strategies ought to be married up pretty closely with your risk assessments. And they're not. What gets done is what gets funded, and what gets funded is basically what the owner companies want to fund.
The bare minimum. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. That's great. Yes.
On the chapters, you mentioned one from the North Slope to Adigan. Who would be on that committee, or who would be in that group? I mean, essentially the people who are there are Alyeska or oil company employees or their subsidiaries.
Right.
And
that's a good question. Yeah.
Because then you don't have the people, unless it's the native. I don't know where the North Slope Bureau ends.
Right. Right.
And the other question I had was, at the beginning you had a picture of a pipeline that didn't look like Alyeska.
Oh, okay. I thought it was, but I'll have to go take a look.
I've been much of the route on the pipeline, but I've never seen supports like that.
Oh, okay.
But it could be, I don't know.
We had somebody else working for us earlier, and she put this PowerPoint together, so she found the slide, I think. So I'll have to check, and if it isn't, I'll have to replace it.
Because all of the above ground pipe is insulated, and that didn't look to be insulated at
Okay,
all.
okay. Good to know, thank you. Need to have truth in advertising. So.
Look Russian to me.
Yikes. Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Are there special, when the pipeline goes over the rivers, are there special checks, or are they checked more frequently, or they have better,
Well, I know like the Yukon River Bridge probably has an annual inspection, and there must be valves at each end. So, but I don't know if those valves are inspected any more frequently than others.
The rest
That's a
of
good
them.
question, yeah. That's a great question.
Do they still do a daily pipeline flyover with helicopters?
They do not. They haven't done that for years, I don't think. Yeah. Did you have a question, Julia?
I was wondering how much, momentum there is for this, and given that, how much sort of theoretical infrastructure there is, like as far as people upriver that are, said, yeah, we're willing and able to be part of the citizen oversight, or we'd even be willing to volunteer our time. Like how much, kind of sort of
Well, it's,
infrastructure's in
I mean, in the
place.
big scheme of things, this idea, we've been talking about it for several years, but in terms of what we can do on the ground, this effort is in its infancy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If people kind of came together to form a voluntary citizen oversight, and they found areas of the pipeline that were in state of disrepair, could they report that, and then would that be listened to by Alyeska?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think they're gonna find anything that's, well, I shouldn't say stuff I don't know. I mean, I don't think they're gonna find stuff that is crumbling or a vertical support member that's fallen down.
Right.
And I know they don't fly over anymore, but I don't know how frequently they, take ATVs or snow machines and go to the inaccessible, go up along the corridor. Do you have any idea, Mark, how frequently they
Yeah,
actually?
no, I think I can answer that. I've certainly heard of and actually been involved in several reports of, hydrocarbon smells along the line, reports by overflights by, military, groups like National Guard people see a big lake of black, and so Alyeska is usually extraordinarily fast in responding to that and checking it out. And so that's the good news. And in reporting back, the bad news that was already in your slide, your presentation, is that leak detection, is basically impossible down to a fairly small threshold, small in a very relative sense of 2,000 barrels. And that's only getting worse as the throughput goes down. Because what they have is they have an ability to detect a spike or a differential in pressure. And the slower the oil moves and the lower the pressure, the less sensitive that equipment is. And so one of the few areas where the state is really looking for some improvements to best available technology is in the realm of leak detection. And so you could have a small leak over one of these watersheds for a very, very long time, and nobody would sort of pick it up because one, there's hardly anybody left on the pipeline. They're all in Anchorage or Fairbanks. And two, there's just no way to pick it up in terms of a pressure differential. And so as a response, and maybe in result of that, Alyeska is quite aggressive in responding to citizen-reported aberrations on the pipeline. I think I saw oil, I think I smelled hydrocarbon, I saw a suspicious man that looked like he might be Al-Qaeda. Whatever the report is, Alyeska is very quick to get out there.
Yeah, that brings up a good point too, when you talked about low flow, because you will hear some people say, oh, the pipeline can't run with fewer than 300,000 barrels and they're gonna shut it down. But the pipeline valuation decision, the Gleason court decision that was written a year ago said, no, that's not the case. It's definitely capable of running on at least 100,000 barrels a day, I think. And therefore, it's probably going to be in operation for several decades to come.
I think it's probably appropriate that people be fairly jaundiced in their willing acceptance of rhetoric that they hear. I mean, it depends on if you're trying to get your tax rate down, then the pipeline's ready to fall apart and it's worthless. And if you're trying to get permits, then it's good for the next 50 years.
Right.
Right now there's a lot of litigation going on between FERC and some of the other non-owner but oil carrier companies. And because this is, an open transmit pipeline, they'll take all comers, they set rates, and those rates determine the profit sharing structure with the state and the tariffs borne by the non-owner companies that ship oil down the pipeline. And so with the strategic reconfiguration, though all those changes were designed to increase safety, increase reliability, and reduce costs. And so folks like Anadarko and Tesoro and the federal government, as well as the state, sued Alyeska because the strategic configuration achieved none of those things. But they wanted to build the cost of the strategic reconfiguration into the rate structure to recoup all those expenses. And so there are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of testimony that are available to the public. You don't have to FOIA them. You can just go online. They're part of the public docket that'll show, you know, what the results are, all the false alarms and all the, you know, stuff going back to, you know, remotely controlled stuff in Anchorage that used to be at pump stations, and, you know, all the presumptions of increased safety that weren't realized, and presumptions of increased reliability that weren't realized, and certainly the reduced costs that were overrun 5 times. And so the other companies said, wait a minute, why are we paying for this fiasco? And the state and the federal government are saying, wait a minute, why aren't we, you know, having reduced tax tariffs based on trying to fluff up the rate structure to recover those costs when it achieved none of those objectives? That's neither here nor there, but I think the point is, depending on whose side of the case you're on, there's a lot of rhetoric out there.
Right.
And so you can look at the testimony and you'll see a lot of experts giving a lot of information on the pipeline that probably is good to know if you're worried about the watershed. Because there's a lot of rhetoric out there that it's going to shut down right away or whatever. And there's also a lot of testimony that's saying, hey, you could just add heaters and you could do this and you could do that. And so it's good to be quite skeptical, I think, of a lot of that rhetoric.
Yeah, good point.
Can any of their pigs, can they determine like really thin spots where there might be a leak to check? Do they have that capability to narrow it down to a really small distance? It seems like with technology now they ought to be able to get a pig to do that, since they do check for thickness, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's,
Yeah.
I don't know how finely tuned they
Yeah, PHMSA regulations require that an instrumented pig, be run and physical inspections of the pipeline be done at least minimally every 3 years. And so that's generally the periodicity they accomplish that with. And that tells them not only the thickness, 360-degree circumference around the pipe, but also the geographic location, so you can see if the pipe is shifted, you know, anywhere along the length. But they run that not every year, but every 3 years. And of course, they run scraper pigs about once a week.
Maybe that should be increased every year.
Right.
For the sensitive pig as it gets
Right,
older.
right, or the places, or at least maybe the sections that are more susceptible to corrosion, they could do it between certain pump stations.
Well, as a result of the Pump Station 1 incident, PHMSA basically issued an administrative order to the pipeline to daylight or at least render inspectable in some way all of those dead legs. You know, the portions of the pipeline and portions of the stations that were not inspectable every 3 years by instrumented pigs or by physical inspection. So the pigs do a pretty good job, because you've got a lot of places where the pipeline is under insulation and it's difficult to see the outside of it. And the only way you can figure out what the condition of the pipe is to run an instrumented pig or pull the insulation off. And there's a lot of places where the pipeline's buried, where you can't do the same unless you unbury it and dig it up, or again, run the instrumented pig. But there are sections where you can't dig it up because it's in concrete. And PHMSA has recently issued an order, you know, after the 2011 Pump Station 1 incident, requiring that in some time certain, Alyeska either daylight those sections of pipe or come up with some other technology to physically inspect them. But they can't keep going and just sort of hope that things don't get bad.
Has there been much scour on any of the river crossings in the Taslina, or, you know, that changed the depth of the pipeline or put it at risk from that?
The Taslina is above ground. The Gokana and the Taslina crossings are above ground, but the Klutina, the Tonsina, and the Little Tonsina, and that I don't know. I don't.
Yeah.
Good question. Any other questions? Comments?
I'm curious about, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, there was some concern about pump station upriver, I think it was either 11 or 9, was determined to be faulty or leaking or about to leak or worn out or something. Do you remember that? And remember there's a few
There was a
articles.
leak at 9, at pump station 9.
9.
Yeah, that was in 2010, I think.
Oh, it was
Yeah.
longer ago than
Are you thinking, oh, okay.
well, my memory's not.
Well, I do have,
I'm just curious what came of that, what resulted in sort of remedies or. if it was
right, I
needed
mean, the
or
pump
something.
station 9 one they did, I don't know if they determined what caused the backup power system to fail. It seemed like it took them, that they were looking into it for months afterward. And then in 2007, there was also a shutdown at pump station 9. So I don't know if that's what you were thinking of, yeah.
So it was longer ago.
Let's see, that one. Well, I've got this fact sheet that you can take a look at
Okay.
afterwards, yeah. I have a few copies of a couple of fact sheets here, and I emailed that stuff to Valdez, so.
About the valves, how come there's nothing about the tank valves be operable? I mean,
Seems pretty basic, doesn't it?
yeah,
Mhm.
I mean.
Well, I think the definition of valve covers sealing. I mean, when you first said that, I thought, she's right. Then I thought about it, I said, no, the word valve means a device that seals. That's what it means, so it'd be redundant to say it again. Be like saying a fishing boat. I mean, by definition, a fishing boat is a boat, so you don't need to say it again. So we say shut-off valve. It means something that shuts off and seals. So you don't need to say shut-off valve that seals, because it seals, valve means something that seals. See what I mean? I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean, that's kind of lawyer talk.
Yeah, or engineer. I mean, an engineer would know that.
No, I think it's lawyer talk.
All right.
Kristin, one of the gentlemen there asked about pump station 9.
Yes.
And one of the implications from that we're still concerned about is, there were quite a number of operators. There were like 30 operators there to do sort of a local drill and exercise. And they managed to sort of drop the power there. And unfortunately, one of the results of that was the Operations Control Center in Anchorage, where the pipelines are remotely controlled, was completely blind. They had no idea, could not see, no visibility of what was going on at pump station 9. And so as a result, some of the valves defaulted open, the pipeline shut down, and then basically all the volume upstream of that discharged into a storage tank, an overflow tank there at pump station 9. And that tank wasn't empty. And so it's designed to hold the whole capacity of the pipeline upstream of that to the next isolation valve. But there was more oil going in, there was room for it, so that tank got overpressured and basically leaked out the top and almost burst. You can see it was pretty radically deformed. The good news is it went out into secondary containment inside a berm, but the bad news is a fairly simple mistake and sort of one mode of failure rendered the whole system blind.
Right.
And so the local folks were totally focused on getting the power back on, and they were oblivious to the risks associated with the oil flowing rapidly into this already half-full tank. So we've commissioned a study, hiring that same fellow you mentioned that got canned after he published a list of maintenance items that need to be done. And I think he was higher than Valdez Terminal. I think he was the number 2 guy at Alyeska at the time he got canned. But to look into if there are any related or parallel vulnerabilities at the terminal, that's what we're, because a lot of the terminal used to be controlled locally, and much of that's controlled in Anchorage as well. And if there are other single points of failure, parallel vulnerabilities, so we're trying to look at that. And we're getting quite a bit of resistance from Alyeska in looking at it, but we're pressing on.
Good. Be interesting to hear what little leads you get out of that process that are connected to pipeline operations too. So keep up the great work. Well, thanks everybody.